Sarah Willingham started working in a restaurant in northern England in her early teens, and by her early 20s she was managing one of the busiest eateries in Paris. She later moved to London, securing a senior management position at a leading British chain, before deciding to break out on her own. Sarah now invests in a wide range of businesses and has been repeatedly cited as one of the UK's most influential business leaders. She's best known perhaps, though, as a judge on the hit TV show Dragon's Den. Money doesn't drive Sarah, but freedom does.
I mean, I've always worked, since the age of 11. I've always had £1 in my pocket and started off delivering newspapers, then washing old ladies' hair on a Saturday, and then worked in the local cafe in Stoke Market before going to a cool restaurant, and then old enough to be behind the bar. And I loved the industry. Didn't think it was necessarily going to be my career at all, actually, but I, fascinated by business, went off to study business, and that was great, and did international business. Found it really interesting and did lots of work placements whilst I was there. And to this day, I don't know why, I was very lucky. I was actually a runner on the Paris Stock Exchange. I'd seen them all wearing these multicoloured jackets. It was one of the old original open outcry floors. I thought, God, that's so cool. The adrenaline and the energy in that room. So I applied to everybody who was in the room and managed to get a job as a runner. Loved it. And I was living in Paris at the time, and meanwhile I had a job in a bar called the Frog and Roast Beef that was run by two INSEAD graduates, owned by two INSEAD graduates. And I worked there on a Sunday afternoon, mainly because I earned a bit of cash, which I needed, but actually they had this great system that they pulled all of the tips, and you could then go and drink in the bar at any point, and your drink would effectively be free and would come out of the tips, which was brilliant because I didn't have any money at all and it was very difficult to get a social life. So it was really cool to be able to do this. Anyway, long story short, but the same people that had helped them to open the Frog and Roast Beef were also doing the Planet Hollywood on the Champs-Elysees, which was the first continental Europe Planet Hollywood. And they were having an absolute nightmare with, I guess, the Americans versus the French. Culturally so different. The Americans were flying on the red eye and what's this and what's that and what's happening. And the French would be sat there going, it's lunchtime. I'm actually just, excuse me, I don't know who you are, but I've got my massive meal that I need to eat. So it was really interesting, the sort of cultural difference between the two. Anyway, they came to the owners of the Frog and Roast Beef and said, could you please help us out? We're really struggling. It's a 3-month job. We need somebody who's got some hospitality experience but speaks fluent French and can bridge that gap. And the guys were like, no, we're opening a second site, we can't. And to this day, I'm so grateful, but they said, but you should speak to this girl actually who does 3 hours for us on a Sunday afternoon. She'd be great. I mean, how random. And then that was it. I guess the rest is kind of history. That's how I...
But can I just ask you about that? Because you weren't experienced enough to do that massive job, but you went ahead with it anyway. A lot of people would have been too scared and would have said no. So why did you say yes?
Oh, I mean, it was so much fun, and there was no doubt it was going to be so much fun. I was lucky in this. I mean, I've always suffered from imposter syndrome. I still do. I think that's a very normal. I think there's a lot of people that suffer from imposter syndrome. But now I've come to love the imposter syndrome because it means that I'm pushing my boundaries again and outside of my comfort zone. But then I used to get a real kick out of it, like a kind of thrill of wow, I've really bitten off more than I can chew this time. This is the one I'm going to get found out at. And I've been saying that for years. This was, 25 years ago now. So it was, I think I knew enough of the French culture to be able to do it. I did know how restaurants operated. And I thought, well, how hard can it be? It's just, you need really good organisational skills, which I was great at. You need to be able to communicate, which I can do. And if they've offered me the job, well, you know, let's give it a go. And I mean, I never looked back. I absolutely loved it. And then they offered me a job to have a much more senior job, kind of running the development of the Planet Hollywood in Euro Disney after that. And then they offered me a job in the head office in Europe, which was great. It was on bottom of Regent Street. I was like 21, and it was in the real heyday of Planet Hollywood. So great parties, you know, every night. It was brilliant. Great time.
So how did you go from there onto your other jobs, which ultimately took you on to being self-employed?
Yeah, so I'd found my thing. I was very, very lucky that very early on I found my thing, and I loved the restaurant industry, loved hospitality. I knew that this was my space. My dad had not let me do a gap year and said I'd got to go and graft and get a proper job. So I was very lucky because I enjoyed the international angle. I was very driven by the need to travel at that point. So business and travel was my thing. And then I quite quickly, I mean, it must have been 2.5 years or something, I now was back in the head office in London. And it became quite apparent that it was not really a sustainable business model. I mean, even with my limited business experience, I was like, I know how much money they spent opening that site, and that turnover, it's not enough in, you know, business model terms. So I started to look around and thought, I loved the international development side. And so this is actually a true story. I bought a copy of the FT thinking I was really clever, because anybody who reads the FT's got to be really clever, right? And I sat at my desk when I was at Planet Hollywood with this massive broadsheet in front of me, turning the pages, looking for businesses that I thought could expand. And in the paper, there were 2 articles that really grabbed me. One was about Pret-a-Manger and one was about Pizza Express. So I then kind of did a bit more research. This was really before proper internet and stuff. So did a bit more research, went out, had a look at the sites and so on. I thought, you know what? Both of those could expand abroad and could be really successful expanding abroad. So I contacted both of them. Pret-a-Manger were literally, who is this random person phoning us?
Fair enough.
I don't know what you're talking about, but thanks for calling, and put the phone down. They did interesting. They did end up expanding abroad, but yeah, they were like, "Who the hell are you?"
What were you doing? You just rang up the main number and asked for.
I rang up, so I did a bit of research. So you know, when you phone a few times to get names, I was that person, and then I tried to get So with Pizza Express, I very quickly found out that they did have an international department. So then I wanted the head of the international department. With Pret, they didn't, so that was harder. So then I managed to get hold of the head of operations. But with Pizza Express, I got hold of the head of the international department. I said, look, this is me. This is what I've done. I would love to come and help you with your international expansion. He said, come in. And so then they offered me a job straight away. That was great. So I went over and ultimately ended up running the international development for Pizza Express. Loved it. Brilliant job. Again, driven by the travel and the love of the business, but I loved living out of a suitcase at the time. It was so much fun. And then I realised that international development was not really for the board. It was not the drive for the business. And I actually thought the board were going to do an MBO. So I went to see the chief executive and said, look, you're not really into this international development stuff. I can see it's not core business. This is all about internal strategy to grow the internal business, the domestic business. And I said, I'm going to leave because I don't want to be part of something that's not core. And they were like, no, don't go. Stay and work for us. And you can do sort of strategic development, they called it, which my dad fell about laughing when I told him. He said that is the first job to get made redundant, just so you know. Anyway, so we did things like put the pizzas into supermarkets. We bought Kettner's. We looked at buying Nando's at the time, but that didn't go through. You know, and actually for me personally, it was really interesting because I think it's a very crucial point in my career in terms of my switch of ending up having the confidence to become an entrepreneur. I shared an office with the chief executive and the MD. And so I was party to most board meetings, most of their conversations. And as this year and a bit went on, I realised that I understood what they were doing. And I understood how they were creating value. And by creating value, I mean, it was a public company at the time. So how they were creating value for their shareholders, which is kind of how we define the success of a business now. You know, yes, it's okay, you might make profit, but is this a lifestyle business and you're just making enough profit at the end of the year? Or actually, are you kind of making yourself redundant and creating value so that at some point it's worth something to somebody else? The point at which it becomes worth something to somebody else is when you've really created value in your business. And I was like, I get it. I understand how they've done this. And I was in my late 20s now, 28, I think. And I'd stopped kind of running around the world, opening restaurants, was back in London. And I thought to myself, and I really wanted a big family. So on a personal level, I still hadn't met my husband, but I'd got this dream of having loads of kids, which I was very lucky and ended up having. And I thought, it kind of all came together at the same time. This thought of, I'm in the wrong place doing the wrong thing if I want freedom, which is ultimately what I've always been driven by. If I want the freedom to be a mom and have a family and still work at my choice, if that makes sense. And the fact that the penny suddenly dropped and I was like, oh, I get it. I see what they're doing here.
So your fear was not being able to have the family that you wanted or the freedom?
It was, yeah, so I think the two go hand in hand, actually, for me anyway. It was ultimately the freedom, but it was the freedom to be able to have the life that I wanted to have. And in my 20s, I could be vehemently selfish because it was only me that I needed to worry about. But then, if you get a family, it's different. Life is just different. You've got other people you have to consider. And actually put first a lot of the time. So, I thought, God, I'm not in a position where I could put my kids first. You know, if I'm working full time, this is going to be really difficult. So that was when I thought, and also I thought I need to make a bit of cash as well, because making a bit of cash also gives you the freedom.
Yeah.
So the whole thing, sort of all came together. So I looked around in the market and thought, Indian food was where it was at. There was 10,000 Indian restaurants and there was no chain. And I understood how to create a chain. What I can't do is you put me in a blank room and I cannot come up with a restaurant. Like, I am not the creator. I will just stare at the walls. Nothing will happen. But what I'm very good at is going into one or two restaurants and going, that is a rollout concept, and I know exactly what I need to do to it to have 15, let's say. So what I looked around, I started to look around and found a lovely chain called the Bombay Bicycle Club that was in South London, and really disorganised, all over the place, but amazing food, like really amazing food, and a very good, loyal customer that were prepared to wait 2 hours on a Friday night to get their curry. So I was like, God, they're really onto something here. Anyway, I went to the board at Pizza Express and said, I'd really like to do to Indian food what we've done to pizzas, and I'd like you to back me. Let's do it. And they were, no, we do pizzas, Sarah. So I thought, well, this is it. This is my window. Do it. And that was one of those where you kind of hold your nose and jump in.
How did you pay then? How did you get the financing?
Yeah, so what I did was I decided to go and do an MBA as well. So I had this wonderfully selfish year, actually, which is very self-indulgent to do an MBA, and it's great. I loved it. But I thought, look, if all else fails, I will have got an MBA. So I was from a really good school, so it's fine. And during the course of that year, I set about raising the finance to buy the company that I would then roll out and some growth capital. And I managed to get the financing so I also, quite randomly, sat on a board of a very small organic supplement business. It's very random. Anyway, I did. But this board were phenomenal. It was, there was a Lord on it. There was the FD of Morrison's. I mean, it was a board that could have done really, really cool stuff. But this business was really small and wasn't going anywhere. So it was quite a bizarre setup. So they were my first port of call, and actually they were delighted. So they were like, yes, we'll back you. Anyway, managed to get the deal to the 11th hour and 59th minute, and I get a phone call from the owners of Bombay Bicycle Club to say, you've been outbid. I was like, what? It's impossible. Nobody else is even looking at the business. And it turned out that the old chief executive and the FD of Pizza Express had floated a cash shell called the Clapham House Group, and had raised loads of money, and they wanted to do, they bought a gourmet burger kitchen, they bought Tootsie's, and they wanted to buy the Bombay Bicycle Club. I was like, you have to be kidding. Couldn't believe it. Anyway,
have they taken your idea, or was that just coincidence?
It definitely wasn't a coincidence, because we discussed it within Pizza Express. David Page, who was the chief executive, had always loved the Bombay Bicycle Club. He was based down there. And I think he absolutely could see the opportunity. And I think if he'd have not been in Pizza Express at the time, he would have loved to have done it. But anyway, he ended up leaving. So I was like, oh my God. Anyway, long story short, I ended up doing a great deal with them. And with my other investors, we then floated a cash shell. So we kind of copied them, did what they'd done at Clapham House Group, floated a cash shell on AIM and set up a business called NutriHealth. Which actually was very successful. So everyone came out really well and was very, very happy with the outcome. And that was kind of my switch into becoming an entrepreneur. So I think the story of my life is that I've been driven by my life, not my career. And, so I ended up going into international restaurants because I didn't take a gap year and I really wanted to travel. I ended up becoming an entrepreneur because I really wanted to have more freedom to be a mom, and to be freer than I was having a corporate career. But I still loved business and still wanted to work. And I ended up selling the Bombay Bicycle Club because at the time I had my second baby. I just realised I couldn't do both, and I had sort of 1,500 staff and in the end 4 kids in 4 years, and I said I can't do both. So that's why I ended up selling the Bombay Bicycle Club and becoming an investor. And I think people use the word pluralist, but when you do lots of stuff basically. And that was, again, my decision was driven by a need in my life to kind of live the best life I could. And I've always been driven by that. And people ask me about my career path. And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. I've never had a career path. I've never, ever had a career specific goal and drive. It's always been my life, and where I've had very clear dreams, I think, of how I wanted my life to be and how I wanted to live my life. And my career has always had to fall into line. And that has meant significant changes along the way. And it's meant I've had to completely change the direction I was going in. But it's always made it very, very, very easy to make decisions when it's been life-driven rather than career-driven, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the sort of, you had these opportunities very early on to work with some very successful people. Is there a common trait? Because what I'm picking up from speaking to people like you is it's not necessarily intelligence, education, or anything. It's some sort of drive that makes someone successful, as opposed to the sort of things you would normally see on paper.
Yeah, I think It's funny, isn't it, drive? It's the one thing I kind of hope my kids get. Everything else is fine. I just hope they're driven in some way. And it's driven for whatever. I'm not talking about a career or money or anything like that. I'm just driven to be the best version of themselves, driven to be good at something. You're just driven, basically. And it's drive's a funny thing because I don't know. I genuinely don't know how much of it you are born with. You know, having had 4 children, they are driven differently, and so much of that is nature. You know, it's in them from the day they were born. And I think that's really very interesting. You know, I can look back and say, well, there was never any pressure put on me at home. You know, nobody ever thought I would do particularly great in my exams or anything like that, and I just sort of bumbled along and was able to get on with it with no barriers put around me. I could say that, but I'm sure I could also have had I could have had a very different upbringing, and I still think I would have been driven. I don't know. I think drive is a very, very interesting subject, because I think at its core, it is what makes you the best version of yourself. You are driven it can be very destructive if it becomes from a negative place, but a positive drive is a real gift if you have it, I think.
But you had the freedom. You were afraid of losing the freedom. So it's not as if there was anything negative that happened to you. You just wanted to retain perhaps what you had initially, which you lost for a while.
Yeah, I mean, but I didn't even see that I lost it. I think because I wasn't driven by the freedom very early on. I was driven by the thirst for knowledge, really. In my early 20s, I just wanted to do more, take on more, see more, be more. You know, it's typical 20s, I guess. The drive for freedom is still something today that I am very, very, very driven by. And everything that I do comes back to, am I less free, you know, by doing this, or am I more free, or is it neutral? You know, where does this sit in my freedom? And I feel that I trade time more than I do anything else. My time is my most valuable commodity. It's what I have that I'll never get back. And so everything that I do, I consider it in its value of time. And have done since having kids, actually. I didn't before that, really, in my 20s. I didn't care. I mean, I did 100-hour weeks and loved it. It was brilliant. When I had the Bombay Bicycle Club, I absolutely worked like crazy and loved every minute of it. But now I'm very much driven by time. And that's why I think it's important to talk about career in the context of life, because life is a journey and it does change, and therefore your desires and needs change. I don't know what I'll be driven by in 10 years' time. I couldn't even hazard a guess. I mean, people who, you know, plan for their retirement, I think, wow, that's impressive, because I don't even know what next week's going to look like, never mind, you know, 20 years' time. And I've now got to the stage where, you know, people always say, so what next? Like, firstly, I don't know. I've just really have no idea what's coming around the corner. But for the first time in many years, you know, I would say for the last sort of 3 or 4 years, my answer now is more of the same. Like, I'm really happy with the way that my life is, and the balance that I have, and the way I spend my time. And I love being challenged, and I also love being a mom. I love sport. You know, I love travel. I love food, you know, so you've
succeeded.
I have in my definition of success. I have more in terms of enrichment in my life than I ever thought I would get. I'm really, really, really happy with it. So now it is about protecting that, rather than driving to get it, if you know what I mean. When I had Minnie, so she was my first baby, I remember holding her really early on, and I looked at her, and I absolutely promised her that, I said to her by school age, I didn't achieve it, but I said to her, by the time you go to school, I will be able to take all your school holidays off with you. That was my dream. That was just everything I'd always wanted to. And it took me 8 years, actually, from that promise to be able to do it. And that was, 4 years ago. And I'm really protective of that now. So, like, I do manage to, and so that was a drive. That was absolutely a drive. And then that became so easy again to make decisions, because stuff comes along and you're like, no, you're definitely not getting me closer to that. So that clarity was, again, driven by a life desire and how I wanted to spend my life rather than career, if that makes sense.
It's fascinating, and congratulations.
Thank
it's great
you.
to hear.
Yeah, I'm very lucky. It's I have a really nice balance, and I'm not driven by the traditional values of success at all. I'm very much driven by having that nice life. Actually, I think life's too short, so you may as well enjoy it.
Sarah, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
I know how valuable it is.